Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, brilliant politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon remains something of an enigma, at times a hopeless romantic idealist, and the bitterest of cynics. His iron will, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit of fire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. It was October 1799, and Napoleon was back in Paris, having received a hero's welcome. The French government, the Directory, had been expecting Napoleon's return from Egypt for months, having summoned him back to France in a letter sent in May, which had been intercepted. On the 17th of October 1799, Napoleon paid his official visit to the Directory at the Luxembourg Palace. Despite being a popular hero, he did not look very threatening. A thin, exhausted-looking young man, bronzed by the sun, his only flamboyant touch was the silk tricolour sash tied around his waist and the Turkish sabre swaying by his side. Reassured by his unassuming manner, publicly, the Directory could only continue to praise and congratulate him. Napoleon was so popular that it would have been political suicide not to. As the newspaper Le Surveillant had declared, "We need Bonaparte." But unlike the French people, the directors were deeply ambivalent. Privately, they toyed with the idea of arresting Napoleon for desertion of his army and quarantine breaking, but this was quickly dropped, after hearing their own guard break out in spontaneous cheers of "Vive Bonaparte" when they spotted him. A few days later, the Directory invited Napoleon to report on his campaign in Egypt. The frosty interview lasted 3 hours. The directors offered Napoleon command of any army of his choice. Napoleon had left Egypt to deal with the threat of foreign invasion, but he returned to find that during the summer the threat had been successfully met by others. Napoleon realized that the real danger to France now lay elsewhere, and he told the directors that he would think their offer over. A few days later, Napoleon had to visit the Luxembourg Palace again, as the directors had invited all the members of the intellectual society, the Institut de France, when Napoleon deliberately avoided them, while he and his entourage only ate the fruit and cheese they had brought with them, fearing being poisoned, which summed up the political climate. France had every reason to loathe the weak, morally discredited Directory. Defeats abroad had not only stripped France of the territory Napoleon had won during his Italian campaign, but also cut France off from German and Italian markets. Britain, Russia, Portugal, Turkey, and Austria had joined the war of the Second Coalition against France, and there was also a quasi-war with America, over debts that the United States were trying to avoid repaying, arguing that she owed the now non-existent French crown, not the French state. There had already been no fewer than 4 French war ministers in the past 8 months, and no one knew how many men were actually in the army, which had received no pay or food supplies for months, and were deserting in high numbers. The economic outlook was bleak. The Directory had abolished the law which kept prices down on staples such as bread, flour, milk and meat, which led to soaring prices, hoarding, rioting and genuine hardship. The English Navy's blockade of France had wrecked overseas trade, and while the public coffers were empty, cash was next to worthless. As government was virtually non-existent, this had led to insecurity and inflation. After a dozen performances of his play, when Napoleon's friend, the playwright Arnaud, received his payout from the theatre, he turned to his mother and said, "France is poorer than ever." When she asked how so, he replied, "Because I'm a millionaire." The taxation of land, doors and windows, the hostage-taking of suspected pro-royalists, and the Jourdan Law of 1798 that introduced nearly universal mass military conscription were all deeply unpopular. Waste and mismanagement were rife, and corruption over government contracts was even more rampant than ever, and was correctly assumed to involve directors like Barras. Freedom of the press had been censored, freedom of association heavily restricted. The 1798 and 79 elections for 1/3 of the legislature had seen widespread fraud. 7/8 of Parisian artisans were unemployed. Civil servants were no longer receiving their salaries. And crucially, the middle-class buyers of nationalized property seized from the church and nobles feared for the security of their new gains. Lawlessness reigned. Gangs of rioters, thieves and rapists terrorized the villages in the countryside, with their crimes going unpunished. Indeed, the roads were so unsafe that part of Napoleon's own luggage had been stolen by bandits, leading his new Mameluke bodyguard Rustam to comment that French nomads had much in common with Egyptian Bedouins. Royalists in the Vendée, Brittany and Provence were again up in arms. And even in Paris, many were awaiting the return of a Bourbon king, since they now thought nothing could be worse than the Directory. Napoleon only had to look at his old social circle to discover the extent of the rot in France. The director Paul Barras had gone downhill, neglecting his work to chase loose women and attend gambling parties. Leading the dissipated life described by his notorious cousin, the Marquis de Sade, Barras would sell any job to pay for his pleasures. A police report described the spread of vice, even among the highest strata of society. Moral depravity is extreme, and the new generation is in great disorder. Sodomy and sapphic love are as out in the open as prostitution, and they are making dreadful progress. The situation was commonly described as a national mess. However, France was not a totally failed state in the autumn of 1799. Indeed, in some areas, the Directory had reason to be optimistic. Some economic reforms were being initiated. Russia had just abandoned the Second Coalition against France. The situation in the Vendée was improving. British forces had been expelled from Holland, and Massena had won some victories in Switzerland, meaning France was no longer in imminent danger of being invaded. But this was only a respite, and France was not safe yet. None of this was enough to dispel the overall impression among the French that the Directory had failed. One morning, Napoleon openly criticised the Directory to General Thibault, contrasting their soldiers' esprit de corps during the Italian campaign with their government's lethargy. A nation is always what you have the will to make it. The triumph of faction, party, divisions is the fault of those in authority only. No people are bad under a good government. just as no troops are bad under a good general. These men are bringing France down to the level of their own blundering. They are degrading her, and she is beginning to reject them. Well, what can generals expect from this government of lawyers? Forthright opinions like these had cost lives earlier on during the Revolution. More depressing than the facts was the attitude of most Frenchmen to those facts. Joseph and Lucien had written novels reflecting the disorder, but both were set far away in distant lands, adopting an attitude of escapism in the face of a situation that seemed to them hopeless. But Napoleon had no use for his brothers' apathy. The Republic, he saw, was again in danger, and it was for him to do something about it. When the house is crumbling, is it the time to busy oneself in the garden? A change here is indispensable. Within the fortnight after his return, Napoleon decided that he would enter politics. This decision naturally stemmed from his own youthful aspirations and writings, but it was strengthened by his experiences in Egypt. As Sultan el-Kabir, he had not only commanded an army, but he had ruled a country, and he believed ruled it well. When Napoleon later came to analyze the motives behind his decision to enter politics, he claimed, "I acted not from love of power, but because I felt that I was better educated, more perceptive, and better qualified than anyone else." Napoleon's first idea was to be elected one of the 5 directors. They held power for 5 years, and they were chosen by the 2 councils, the 500 who drafted laws, and the ancients who approved them. But the directors' own wishes counted for quite a lot. So Napoleon went to the Luxembourg Palace to see Paul Barras, his one-time patron, who had shown a remarkable survival instinct. Of the 5 directors originally elected back in 1795, Barras had won the smallest number of votes, and yet had still managed to stay a director all this time, the only member who had. Barras, though Napoleon did not yet know it, was in the last stages of secret negotiations with royalists abroad to hand France over to the Bourbons by placing the guillotined king's brother on the throne. For this, Barras was to be paid 12 million francs. Unsurprisingly, Barras treated the young general very coolly, and made it clear that he did not take his ex-protégé seriously as a political leader. Napoleon's natural leaning to work with him was shattered, and Barras passed him on to the Directory's president, Goyer. But if Napoleon was hoping for any support there, he was rudely disappointed. Goyer pointed out that, according to the Constitution, no one under 40 could become a director. Napoleon was only 30. Goyer said to him, with a hint of condescension, that he would be sure to enter the government, but not now. So you would stand by a rule that deprives the Republic of capable men? In my view, General, there could be no excuse for tampering with the law. President, you are clinging to the letter that kills. And so, Napoleon found himself blocked from joining the government. As a result, he decided that a new constitution must be brought into being, with a lower age limit. How this might be done, the Directory themselves had already demonstrated. On 2 separate occasions, the directors had surrounded the council chambers with troops, in order to frighten members into annulling the elections of 50 deputies whose views they feared. That June, there had already been a mini-coup, the so-called Parliamentary Day, when General Joubert, with Barras's and Sieyes' support, had used force to replace 2 of the directors. Indeed, Goyer, who clung so stubbornly to the constitution, belonged to a government which had twice acted unconstitutionally, and many Frenchmen believed that in doing so, they had forfeited all claim to lawful authority. Perhaps worst of all, people could not see how anything could improve, because for this constitution to be changed took a 9-year process. By contrast, the constitutions that Napoleon had recently imposed on the Cisalpine, Venetian, Ligurian, and Helvetian republics, along with his reforms in Malta and Egypt, made him look like an energetic, efficient reformer who believed in strong government and central control, solutions that might work well for France. But Napoleon was not influential enough to overthrow the Directory alone. First through Napoleon's door was 45-year-old Talleyrand, who had been recently forced to resign as foreign minister when he had characteristically been caught repeatedly and insistently demanding $25,000 in gratification from 3 American diplomats before he would even agree to negotiate with them. Talleyrand worried that Napoleon would hold his non-appearance at Constantinople to negotiate peace with the Turks against him, but he was instantly forgiven. Another early visitor to Napoleon was Roederer, a highly intelligent politician and France's leading political journalist, who had survived every succeeding revolutionary regime. France was now divided into 3 political factions. The left-wing Jacobins, who had overseen the bloody days of the Terror, with Barras supposedly at their head and supported by the mob of Paris. The moderate Republicans, led by Sieyes, and the secret Royalists, who wanted to restore the Bourbons and turn back the clock. These 3 parties, fearing each other in the midst of the general anarchy, hoped to secure Napoleon's support and claim him as their own. "I would never be of any party, as I am for the union of all," he declared. "I am a member of the great party of the French people." First, in his own mind, Napoleon studied the political landscape and matured his plans. But there were so many active plots to overthrow the Directory swirling around Paris, perhaps as many as 10, that Napoleon might not be the first to launch one. There were 4 top generals who all thought themselves Napoleon's equal: the plain-speaking Augereau, the zealous Republican Jourdan, blunt old Kellerman, and the shifty Bernadotte. Each fancied himself the much-needed strongman who could solidify the French Revolution, and they all secretly plotted to oust the directors and to assume a military dictatorship under the guidance of an experienced politician. It just so happened that Napoleon was now approached by the recently appointed director, the politically well-connected Sieyes, author of the pamphlet "What is the Third Estate?", which had helped kickstart the revolution. When he was asked what he did during the years of the Terror, he replied, "I survived." Sieyes was now 51 and had been a prominent speaker for liberal principles. One of his colleagues said of him, "If there were a curtain in this hall, one could be sure that Sieyes was hiding behind it." He lived alone in a bachelor apartment with a bust of his hero Voltaire. Sieyes was a thin man with a long pointed nose and weak voice, but he was not without courage. Once, a discontented priest called Poul rushed into his room and stabbed him in the wrist and stomach. Sieyes coolly told his concierge, "If a Monsieur Poul should call again, tell him I'm not at home." Sieyes concluded that the government, of which he was a leading member, was simply too incompetent and corrupt to deal with the issues facing France. He wanted to change the constitution, which could only be accomplished by a coup d'etat, an idea he had been contemplating for many months. He wanted to replace the Directory with a government made up of a first consul, naturally a role held by himself, and 2 assistants, one for internal affairs, the other for the defense of the borders. This was why he needed a general, or muscle, to see the coup through. When his first choice, General Joubert, had been shot through the heart in battle, Sieyes had little choice but to turn to Napoleon. "Our salvation now demands both a head and a sword," Sieyes said. Napoleon had both. Napoleon's popularity with Parisians was also undoubtedly a factor in Sieyes' decision. At one visit to the theatre, Napoleon sat at the back of his box, placing his friend and aide Duroc at the front. but the calls for Bonaparte grew so loud that they were forced to swap places, as Napoleon presumably expected might happen. Napoleon and Sieyes, at first, did not see eye to eye. The stumbling block was their mutual dislike. Napoleon could not abide Sieyes's pompous intellectual pretensions, while Sieyes was wary of this up-and-coming young general. Neither of them would make the first move. Childish games ensued. Napoleon enraged Sieyes by ignoring him at dinner, then Sieyes slighted him back by ignoring a messenger who had been sent to arrange a meeting. "Did you see that insolent little fellow?" said Sieyes. "He would not even condescend to notice a member of the government who, if they had done right, would have ordered him to be shot." "What," Napoleon said, "could have induced them to put that priest in the Directory? He is sold to Prussia. Unless you take care, he will deliver you up to that power." The pride of both men was soothed by Talleyrand, who intervened because time was growing short. To Sieyes, he stressed Napoleon's irreproachable Republican record. And to Napoleon, he argued, "You want the power, and Sieyes wants the Constitution. Therefore, join forces." On the 24th of October, the two directors, Sieyes and Ducos, finally went to Napoleon to formally propose that he help them carry out their coup d'etat. "We need a new constitution," they said, "with a powerful government." This aligned perfectly with Napoleon's own views, and he agreed immediately. Sieyes went over the details of his plan, both for the coup and for the new constitution they were going to create. Napoleon made no objections, only insisting that the French people be consulted on the new constitution with a public vote. Napoleon discovered that he and Sieyes had much in common, and that he had the experience in higher politics that Napoleon lacked. Napoleon told him, "We have no government because we have no constitution, at least not the kind we need. It is for your genius to create one. Once that is done, nothing will be easier than to govern." Sieyes was also impressed and confided to a friend, "I intend to march with General Bonaparte because, of all the soldiers, he is closest to being a civilian." Napoleon's decision to cooperate with the moderate Republicans stemmed from the fact that not so long ago he had been one himself. As Napoleon explained, "Had I joined the Jacobins, I would have risked nothing. But after conquering with them, it would have been necessary almost immediately to conquer against them. A club cannot endure a permanent chief. It wants one for every successive passion. Now, to make use of a party one day in order to attack it the next, under whatever pretext it is done, is still an act of treachery. It was inconsistent with my principles." Suspecting a conspiracy afoot, on the 28th of October, Goyer tried to force Napoleon to take command of an army abroad, letting him take his pick. Napoleon declined, claiming he was unwell. Through the press, the directors also secretly accused him of embezzlement back in Italy, which Napoleon vigorously denied. Then Barras became suspicious of a plot too. The moment that finally decided Napoleon to pass the point of no return came when he dined with Barras at the Luxembourg. Barras proposed that General Dédouville, who Napoleon thought excessively mediocre, should become President of France to save the Republic. "As for you, General," Barras sighed, "your intention is to return to the army, and I, sick, unpopular, worn out, I am good for nothing except to return to private life." In one of Napoleon's recollections, he said he only stared at Barras without replying. But in another, he recalled, "I answered in a manner calculated to convince him that I was not his fool. He looked down and muttered a few remarks that at once decided me." As a last-ditch effort, with his fellow director General Moulin, Barras tried to bring Napoleon into his scheme for restoring the Bourbons. Of course, Napoleon refused. Realizing his blunder, Barras went to visit Napoleon the next morning to try to make amends. But Napoleon sent word that he was tired and unwell, coming from the dry climate of the sands of Arabia. As Napoleon confided to Bourrienne, I believe that I shall have Bernadotte and Moreau against me. But I do not fear Moreau. He is devoid of energy. He prefers military to political power. We shall win him by the promise of a command. But Bernadotte has Moorish blood in his veins. He is bold and enterprising. He does not like me, and I am certain that he will oppose me. If he should become ambitious, he will dare anything. This fellow is not to be cajoled. He is disinterested and clever. But after all, we have just arrived. We shall see. Napoleon first tried to win over General Moreau. The two rivals were introduced at a dinner party held by Goyer, and first eyed each other without speaking, until Napoleon made the first move, telling him how earnestly he had wanted to meet him. 2 days later, as a token of his esteem, Napoleon sent Moreau a beautiful diamond-hilted dagger, and the alliance was cemented. Moreau gave his crucial backing for the coup, but refused to lead it himself, and is reported to have said, which he would later regret, pointing to Napoleon, "There's your man. He will make a much better job of your coup than I could." Napoleon had to rely mostly on his own character to win support. He was short of money, as Josephine had spent so much of his general's pay that he found he had less than 2,000 francs in ready cash. But since the Rue de la Victoire was the headquarters for the coup, Josephine played a key role. Her salon provided the perfect cover for the surreptitious toing and froing of conspirators, and since her gatherings attracted influential figures, they were useful for winning over key players who needed informing and convincing. As Ségur noted, her discretion, her grace, her gentle manner, her cool composure, her ready ingenuity and wit were of great service. She was doing her best to justify Napoleon's renewed confidence in her. Not only was Napoleon grateful for her help, but he was once more happy being with her, going so far as to tell Talleyrand of the delight he felt, while Josephine said she found her husband more affectionate than ever. Goyer, who Napoleon recalled, loved good cheer and was a simple-minded fellow, was still infatuated with Josephine and was easily taken in by her charm. He was kept busy by frequent invitations to the Rue de la Victoire, where Josephine distracted him with gentle flirtation, while subtly gaining his views on the government. During one small select dinner party, the conversation turned to the turquoise used by the people of the East to clasp their turbans. Napoleon took 2 such richly set turquoise brooches from a drawer and gave one to Goyer. "It is a little toy," he said, "which we Republicans may give and receive without impropriety." Napoleon also enlisted Josephine's help to charm General Bernadotte, the Gascon with dark good looks, and the biggest enigma of all. After he'd left Italy, Napoleon had recommended that Bernadotte be sent to Vienna as ambassador, but his overt display of his republicanism provoked a Viennese mob to attack his embassy and tear down the French flag, prompting his resignation. Back in Paris, Bernadotte was named Minister of War with the support of Napoleon's brothers. His abrasive style meant he didn't last for long. When told that there was no money in the treasury, Bernadotte simply sent orders to stir up the troops at the front, who then looted the funds he needed, an incident which made the Directory wary and had dismissed him from office in September. Not a single schemer in Paris knew what to make of Bernadotte, who would agree with every politician who told him he should be the future leader of France, and he bragged until they were convinced that he was ripe for a coup. But then he would do nothing. He was also now married to Désirée Clary, Napoleon's first love and ex-fiancée. When she was asked why she had chosen Bernadotte as her husband, she replied, "Because he is the only one man enough to stand up to Napoleon." Rivals in both romance and politics, the two men already hated each other. But a meeting was arranged, when the two couples were invited to a gala at Joseph's sumptuous new chateau, Mortefontaine. Napoleon arranged for Josephine and him to share the same carriage with the Bernadottes, which was going to be an uneasy journey, given the two men's mutual hostility, and the fact that the last time Désirée had seen Napoleon, they had still been engaged to be wed. Despite Napoleon and Josephine's efforts, the ride was plagued by heavy silences. Joining her sister later that evening, Desiree mimicked and laughed at Josephine's lash-fluttering efforts, describing her as an aged courtesan with a deservedly bad reputation. Desiree had already given Bernadotte a son, which probably made the still childless Napoleon secretly seethe, who she now graciously invited to become godfather and choose the name, which Napoleon accepted, calling him Oscar from a favourite poem by Ossian. In his talk with Bernadotte, Napoleon condemned the violence and lawlessness of the Jacobins. "Your brothers," Bernadotte replied, "were the founders of that club, and yet you reproach me with favouring its principles. It is to the instructions of someone, I know not who, that we are to ascribe the agitation which now prevails." "True, General, and I would rather live in the woods than in a society which presents no security against violence." Napoleon reported of their talk. Bernadotte confessed that he thought us all lost. He spoke of external enemies, of internal enemies, and at that word he looked steadily in my face. I also gave him a look, but patience, the pear will soon be ripe. But the coup almost did not happen. Riding on his horse at the chateau, Napoleon was thrown 15 feet. He lay unconscious for hours, as his horrified family waited tensely until he eventually came to. Unmoved by the persuasions of Berthier, the impatient Lannes, his sister-in-law Julie Clary, and Napoleon himself, Bernadotte became what Napoleon called the obstacle man. A week later, Bernadotte refused to attend a banquet held in Napoleon's honour, until Bonaparte has satisfactorily explained the reasons which have caused him to forsake his army. "I do not care to dine in the company of a plague carrier." Bernadotte even suggested that Napoleon should be court-martialed. It was welcome news to Napoleon that the Minister of Police, Fouché, who had eyes and ears across Paris, was supporting the coup, since he was never found on the losing side, although he also had contingency plans to switch sides and arrest the conspirators if their attempt failed. The alliance between the conspirators was uneasy. Sieyes pictured himself as its leading light, while Fouché and Talleyrand were in it for the money, the power, and the love of intrigue itself. According to one story, Napoleon was plotting at Talleyrand's house when loud bangs were heard in the street below. Fearing they were about to be arrested, they blew out the candles and rushed to the balcony, but were hugely relieved to see the commotion had been caused by a carriage accident of gamblers returning from the Palais Royal. Napoleon had even begun to sleep with 2 loaded pistols by his bed. He had good reason to be worried. The 7,000 troops in the Paris district were under the Directors' orders, 3 of whom viewed Napoleon with suspicion, and as yet they had no bayonets. It was with top secrecy that Napoleon had Roederer print posters, which would be displayed across the city on the day chosen for the coup. Referring to the 2 occasions when the directors had eliminated newly elected deputies, the posters were titled, "They have acted in such a way that there is no longer a constitution." Napoleon met Sieyes secretly at Lucien's house on the 1st of November to coordinate the details of the coup. They agreed on tactics. From the outset, they rejected the idea of staging a military coup. Their change of regime had to meet 2 democratic conditions. It had to be carried out with the approval of the majority of the French people, and without bloodshed. The plan was simple. They would invite the directors to resign, so leaving a power vacuum. To replace the directors, they would ask the 2 councils, the Ancients and the 500, to appoint a provisional government of 3 men, which included themselves. Opposition was expected in the Jacobin Council of 500, but Lucien had, in Napoleon's reflected glory, just been elected its president, which was going to prove extremely useful. Still, they feared that the Paris mob was likely to join in, and to prevent bloodshed, that day, Sieyes' friends in the Ancients would have the 2 councils relocated to the Palace of Saint-Cloud, just outside Paris. A week before the coup, Napoleon would ask Roederer if he worried it would be difficult. It would only be difficult not to do it. It is 3/4 done. "There's no one more meticulous than me when I make a military plan," Napoleon told Roederer. "I exaggerate all the possible dangers and all the possible harms in the circumstances. I get in a very tiresome agitation. This doesn't prevent me looking very serene in front of those surrounding me, like a woman who's giving birth. And when I'm decided, everything is forgotten except what can make it succeed." The night before the coup, Napoleon dined with Cambacérès and was reported to be extremely relaxed, even singing a favourite revolutionary tune that his entourage said he only sang when his spirit was tranquil and heart satisfied. Of course, Napoleon may well have been putting on a show for his fellow conspirators and been secretly racked with nerves. The morning of the 9th of November 1799, the famous 18th of Brumaire, dawned cold and grey, with patches of fog, and the regiments of Paris marched to the boulevards to be reviewed by Napoleon, who was up early that day, and soon every room in his house was crowded with soldiers and politicos, and there were so many that they even spilled out into the streets. "So here's the day for clearing out the rubbish dump," one soldier was heard to say. Napoleon took each man into his study to explain what the day entailed, and then gathered his officers and the soldiers in the courtyard. He forcefully explained to them the Republic's desperate situation and asked them to show their loyalty to him with an oath of allegiance to the two councils, which, in fact, he was in the process of abolishing. The most important officer then arrived, General Lefebvre, a big, rough, hard-headed man of the people, now the military governor of Paris. He looked Napoleon full in the face and demanded, "What the hell is going on here?" Napoleon took him by the arm, led him to one side, and explained that they must save the Republic. Lefebvre scowled at him, but Napoleon guessed that behind his gruff manner hid a warm heart. "Here is the sword I carried at the Battle of the Pyramids. I give it to you as a token of my esteem and confidence." He handed over his fine damascened blade to Lefebvre, who was almost reduced to tears by the gesture, and replied, "I am ready to throw those buggers of lawyers into the river." At that moment, the Council of Ancients passed the decree, thanks to Sieyes' influence, that Napoleon and the conspirators had been hoping for. The two chambers, deemed to be under threat, were to relocate to the chateau of Saint-Cloud for the next day. Another decree stated that Napoleon was named commander of all the military forces in the city, 7,000 men, to secure the public peace. Napoleon read the decree aloud to his soldiers. "Gentlemen," he concluded, "will you help me save the Republic?" Cheers rose up, and drawing their swords, they waved them in the air, shouting, "We swear it! We swear it!" The bewildered Barras sent his secretary with an angry protest, who arrived in the middle of Napoleon's speech, and must have regretted going, as Napoleon publicly harangued him in front of the soldiery. "Where," he exclaimed, "is that beautiful France which I left you so brilliant? I left you peace. I find war. I left you victorious. I find only defeats. I left you the millions of Italy. I find taxation and beggary. Where are the 100,000 men, my companions in glory? They are dead. This state of things cannot continue. It will lead to despotism." At 10 a.m., Napoleon entered the Council of the Ancients as planned, whose support had already been secured by Sieyes. Napoleon delivered a speech, calling for national unity. "You are the wisdom of the nation," he flattered them. "To you it belongs to organize measures for the salvation of the Republic. I come, surrounded by our generals, to offer you support. Let us not look into the past for precedents. Nothing in history resembles the 18th century. Nothing in the 18th century resembles the present moment. We want a republic founded on true liberty, on civil liberty, on national representation. We will have it, I swear it." This was well received, and he took his oath of office. They named Napoleon executor of a new temporary constitution, and Sieyes, Ducos, and Napoleon as provisional consuls, a term borrowed from the ancient Roman Republic. General Moreau was then sent to the Luxembourg Palace, to tell the 5 directors of the decree that had just been passed, and of the dissolution of their rule, demanding their resignations. The other panicked directors tried to get hold of Barras, but he let it be known that he was in the bath, hoping for a last-minute approach from Napoleon, which did not come. Barras later swore that if he had known that Sieyes was working with Napoleon, he would have fired a pistol shot at Sieyes through the palace window. Talleyrand's role was to ensure that Barras resigned as director without a fuss. And later that day, he limped into the Luxembourg with the dramatic precaution of a pair of pistols in his pocket and 1,000,000 francs as a sweetener to make Barras cooperate. He handed Barras his pre-written resignation to sign, and to pressurize him, told him to look outside the window onto the street, pointing out the soldiers fraternizing with the crowds who were demanding the Directory's abolition. Fearing that Napoleon would investigate his corruption and embezzlement, and after being promised that he could keep all his estates, Barras signed his resignation in no time. Talleyrand kissed his hand and called him a true patriot. True to form, Talleyrand profited from the situation, keeping the other half of the bribe for himself. Only 2 directors were left, Goyer and Moulin. It took a majority of the 5 to allow the directors to make any valid decision, and therefore the 2 of them had now been made powerless. They rushed to the Tuileries to find Napoleon, who greeted them with cool cordiality. "I am glad to see you. I do not doubt that you will both resign. Your patriotism will not allow you to oppose a revolution which is both inevitable and necessary." But Goyer insisted, "I do not yet despair, aided by my colleague Moulin, of saving the Republic." "With what will you save it? With the Constitution which is crumbling to pieces?" Just then, a messenger entered the room, telling them that Santerre, the brewer, who during the Reign of Terror had gained a bloody notoriety as leader of the Jacobins, was trying to whip up the Paris mob. "General Moulin, you are a friend of Santerre. Tell him that at the very first movement he makes, I will order him to be shot." Moulin was apologetic. "The Republic is in danger. We must save it. It is my will. Sieyes, Ducos and Barras have resigned. You are 2 individuals, isolated and powerless. I advise you not to resist." But they still refused to resign. Napoleon had no time to parley. He had them both sent back to the Luxembourg, separated and placed under house arrest. The next day, they signed their resignations. Later, Moulin rejoined the army and served under Napoleon's command, while Goyer retired to his estate and later became Napoleon's ambassador to Holland. As for Barras, he spent his early political retirement in luxury at his chateau of Grosbois. But he never forgave Napoleon or Josephine for robbing him of power, later writing viciously about both of them in his memoirs. Napoleon always remained wary of Barras, and placing him under surveillance by Fouché's spy network, became convinced of his conspiratorial activities and exiled him to Brussels the next year. Fouché, keen to show his new fealty to Napoleon, told him he had just closed the gates of Paris, preventing anyone from entering or leaving the city. "What means this folly?" a displeased Napoleon said. "Instantly countermand those orders. Do we not march with the opinion of the nation, and by its strength alone? Let no citizen be disturbed. Let every publicity be given to what is done." All had gone according to plan. There was now a power vacuum, for which, the next day at Saint-Cloud, the conspirators were hoping to provide a solution. But that evening, as Napoleon rode past the Place de la Révolution, where King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Robespierre, and so many others had been guillotined, he said, "Tomorrow we'll either sleep at the Luxembourg or we'll end up here." The events of the next day were almost catastrophic. Napoleon got up at 4 a.m. and rode to Saint-Cloud, where he met Murat, under command of 6,000 soldiers of the Paris district. They were surrounding the palace, officially there to guard the Council of the Ancients and the 500. The day got off to a bad start for the conspirators, when they discovered that the halls of Saint-Cloud had not yet been prepared for the two councils, who were fussy about their decor. Nothing was ready, and the delay allowed the Jacobin opposition in the Council of the 500 the chance to lobby for support and plan their next moves. Unable to miss the heavy military presence, the rumours swirled. Napoleon joined Sieyes, who had the precaution of a suitcase stuffed with cash with him, ready for a quick getaway, in a study, and prepared for a long wait. Napoleon paced the room up and down, occasionally poking the fire. As soon as the halls were at last opened at 1 p.m, the two councils met, and full-scale raucous debates began, while Napoleon and his supporters waited with growing impatience. In the 500, cries of "Down with the dictator," "Death to the tyrant," "Vive la Constitution" filled the hall, as well as proposals to outlaw Napoleon. They brandished the threat of Caesarism, gave liberty or death speeches, and dramatically swore a fresh oath to the Constitution. No one in that hall dared to risk their life by refusing to do so. The other council, the Ancients, became alarmed by the unexpected violence of the lower house's opposition, and Napoleon's supporters there began to waver and recede, with some insisting to know why this crisis was not solved by simply naming 3 new directors, and everyone going back to business. Napoleon had been hoping for a quick vote instead, in which they would approve a new government and constitution altogether. The hours of waiting and inaction proved too frustrating for Napoleon, and he lost his patience. "Now you see what they are doing," he exclaimed to Sieyes, and beating the floor with his horsewhip. "This must have an end." At 4 p.m, Napoleon decided to seize the bull by the horns and enter the Hall of the Ancients to give a speech to rally his supporters there. On his way, he came across Bernadotte, who was watching the coup from the sidelines. "You are marching to the guillotine," he sternly remarked. Napoleon replied, "We'll see." Leaving his soldiers standing by the door, Napoleon strode into the magnificent gilded hall. The agitated room descended into hushed silence as he stopped in the centre of it and surveyed the 250 ancients. "Gentlemen, the circumstances in which you find yourselves are not ordinary. You are on the edge of a volcano. You deemed the Republic in danger. You called me to your aid. I obeyed. And now I am assailed by 1,000 calumnies. They talk of Caesar, of Cromwell, of military despotism, as if anything in antiquity resembles the present moment. Danger presses. Disaster thickens. We no longer have a government. The directors have resigned. The 500 are in a tumult. Secret agents are instigating Paris to revolt. Agitators would gladly bring back the revolutionary tribunals. But fear not. Aided by my companions in arms, I will protect you. I desire nothing for myself but to save the Republic, and I solemnly swear to protect that liberty and equality for which we have made such sacrifices." Rallied by Napoleon's presence and daring words, his supporters regained their courage, and 2/3 of them even stood up in support. Napoleon continued, "In fact, conspiracies are being hatched in its name. I know all the dangers which threaten you. If liberty perishes, you will be accountable to the universe, history, France, and your families." But then one of the deputies challenged him. "What dangers? Name the conspirators." "I shall protect you from dangers, surrounded by my comrades in arms," Napoleon repeated, attempting a new note, and with a glance at his soldiers by the door. "Grenadiers, I see your bearskins and bayonets. With them I have founded republics." Napoleon then called on his grenadiers to tell the ancients, "Have I ever deceived you? Have I ever betrayed my promises when in the camps, in the midst of privations, I promised you victory and plenty, and when at your head I led you from success to success? Was it for my interests or for those of the Republic? And the Constitution? one deputy shouted, which caught Napoleon in a trap. There was a long silence, but he composed himself and smashed back an answer. The Constitution. You yourselves annihilated it. You violated it when the executive infringed the rights of the legislature. You violated it when the legislature struck at the independence of the executive. You violated it when, with sacrilegious hand, both the legislature and the executive struck at the sovereignty of the people by annulling their elections. The Constitution, it is a mockery, invoked by all, regarded by none. At that moment, news arrived that the Council of 500 were forcing their president Lucien to vote to outlaw Napoleon. There was not a moment to lose. If they voted him an outlaw, Napoleon would be put to death. I would then have given 200 millions, Napoleon recalled, to have had Ney by my side. Aware that he had not won over the ancients, Napoleon sensed that he was in deep trouble. He seemed unsure what to say, and in desperation took an aggressive approach. If any orator, paid by foreigners, shall talk of outlawing me, I will appeal for protection to my brave companions in arms, whose plumes are nodding at the door. Remember that I march joined by the god of fortune and by the god of war. This was too much for the ancients. There were some angry cries. Such words were a scandalous thing to say to the Republic's elder statesman. Instead of like a politician, Napoleon was acting like a general on the offensive. "Leave the room, General. You don't know what you're saying," Bourrienne whispered to him. Napoleon realized that he had struck completely the wrong note with that last line. With a final plea that the ancients should form a provisional government and take measures appropriate to the danger, Napoleon strode out of the room, his supporters there relieved to see him gone. But Napoleon never rested on a setback. He composed himself after the debacle, but his jaw was set. Followed by his entourage, he went to try his luck with the Council of 500, though he foresaw an overwhelmingly hostile reaction from the Jacobins. Leaving his grenadiers behind at the door, Napoleon entered the grey bare hall of the 500, and the deputies in it looked grim. He entered the hall on his own and strode halfway across it to reach the podium to speak. Almost at once, he heard cries go up from the deputies, outraged at seeing soldiers at the door of a democratic chamber. Napoleon felt his arm seized by a Jacobin deputy, Bigonnet, who shouted at him, "How dare you? Leave at once! You're violating the sanctity of the law!" A hubbub ensued, and furious shouts erupted from all parts of the hall. "What means this? Down with the tyrant! Begone! Begone!" In the uproar, Napoleon tried to make himself heard, but they refused to let him speak. "Down with the tyrant! Outlaw! Caesar! Cromwell!" An eyewitness heard Napoleon shouting back, "I want no more factionalism! This must finish! I want no more of it!" While the president of the council, his brother Lucien, pleaded for Napoleon to be given a hearing and banged his presidential gavel, angry deputies began to cluster around Napoleon. One of the larger ones grabbed him by the shoulder and yelled in his face, "Was it for this that you won your victories?" Some deputies climbed onto their benches in protest, while others surged towards the figure in the blue uniform, trying to push, jostle, and even trying to punch him, some grabbing him by his collar. The one thing that Napoleon would always fear, perhaps from seeing the horrors of the revolution, was an angry crowd. He turned deadly pale, his breathing grew heavy, and he began to feel faint. Described as pale, emotional, hesitating, he turned to try to leave the room, but found his path blocked. As soon as it looked like he might be in physical danger, the grenadiers at the door rushed into the room to protect him, which only infuriated the deputies more. Napoleon was so pressed between the deputies, his staff and the grenadiers, that I thought for a moment he would be smothered. He could neither advance nor go back. Blows were exchanged, and a rumour spread that a dagger was even struck at Napoleon's chest, reminding everyone of the fate of Caesar. The grenadiers eventually drove the deputies back with their bayonets, and encircling Napoleon, hauled him out of there to safety. When he burst out into the courtyard, staggering and stammering in front of the soldiery, Napoleon announced, "I offered them victory and fame, and they have answered me with daggers." Napoleon got on his horse, but then fell off it, to the alarm of his men. Whether he actually collapsed or was pretending to be hurt, his iron nerves were, for once, shaken. Nothing like this had happened to him before. His face had been scratched by angry fingers, and trickles of blood were running down his cheeks. He was used to the dangers of the battlefield, but he had not been prepared for this civil rage. Napoleon may have dithered for as long as half an hour. Lavalette believed this was the most dangerous moment of all. As if one of the other generals had put themselves at the head of his troops, it would have been difficult to guess what might have happened. During this dangerous hiatus, Augereau, a member of the 500, who had not committed himself either way, came outside to say to Napoleon, somewhat unhelpfully, "You're in pretty deep water now," to which Napoleon snapped, "Rubbish. Matters were much worse at Arcole," and then threatened Augereau not to go over to the opposition. "Believe me, keep quiet if you don't want to end up a victim in all this. In half an hour, you'll see how things turn out. Say to your friends, the cork has been drawn. We must now drink the wine." Sieyes kept calm and argued that anyone declaring Napoleon an outlaw was himself by definition an outlaw, and said to him, "You were put outside the law, and you put them outside the hall." The crisis point of the French Revolution had suddenly arrived. Lucien, as its president, tried to call the 500 to order. His brother, he said, had only been doing his duty by coming into the hall to see how things stood. But the deputies shouted him down, demanding that Lucien declare his brother an outlaw. Very worked up, with tears in his eyes, Lucien tried one of his grand gestures. Since he, their president, could no longer make himself heard, he would resign, and he flung off his red toga. As he foresaw, the deputies begged him to put it on again. Aware that he might be able to delay the vote to outlaw his brother, he scribbled a message to Napoleon. "You have 10 minutes to act." Napoleon had not wanted to use force, but he now had no other choice. To be outlawed meant being executed by firing squad, or a trip to the guillotine. At this moment, Napoleon and Lucien must have thought back to Corsica, from where they had also been outlawed and condemned to death by Paoli, only 5 years before. Napoleon sent some soldiers to rescue Lucien, who was still surrounded by the enraged deputies keeping him in the hall against his will, as they needed their president there to keep the session technically lawful. Some of them were even trying to physically hold Lucien down in his chair while they began the vote to outlaw Napoleon. The soldiers rushed into the room, drove back the deputies, and declaring, "It is by your brother's commands," escorted Lucien out safely into the courtyard. At a signal from Napoleon, drums rolled, and with Lucien at his side, they rode along in front of his troops to rally them, calling on them to clear the 500 deputies out of the hall before they declared Napoleon an outlaw. Lucien declared, "The Council of 500 is dissolved. It is I that tell you so. Assassins have taken possession of the hall of meeting. I summon you to march and clear it of them." But some of the 500 deputies had flung open the big palace windows and were pointing accusing fingers at Napoleon. The soldiers were disconcerted and did not know who to believe. But the first moment of stupefaction was, however, followed by tumultuous cries, the effect of Bonaparte's speech to his troops. "Soldiers, I led you to victory. Can I rely upon you? Soldiers, there was reason to believe that the Council of 500 would save the country. On the contrary, it is given up to dissensions within itself. Turbulent and scheming men are trying to direct all its rage against me. Soldiers, can I rely on you?" When they cried in the affirmative, "Well then, I am about to bring them to reason." 4 times, Napoleon said, he had risked his life for France, only to find greater danger in an assembly of assassins. The troops could certainly see the blood on his face, and they shouted, "Vive Bonaparte!" Yet, the 400-strong legislative guard, there to protect the councils, still seemed hesitant. It was Lucien, with his flair for drama, who found the perfect gesture. Leaping onto his horse, he harangued the guards, claiming the majority of the 500 were being terrorized by a minority of fanatics armed with daggers, in the pay of English gold. He then drew his sword and solemnly pointed it at Napoleon's chest. "I swear to stab my own brother through the heart if he ever interferes with the freedom of Frenchmen." Lucien's eloquence did the trick. The doubters were won over, and Napoleon now had all the troops behind him. All day long, Murat had been urging Napoleon to use the troops, rather than the pretense of legality, to overthrow the Directory. Murat led the column and ordered, "Charge, bayonets, forward!" The drums beat the charge, and the bristling line of bayonets steadily advanced to evacuate the whole of the 500. The more timid deputies slipped away, but the majority stayed put. The grenadiers began to file into the hall, ignoring the deputies, who appealed to the law and constitution and urged them to disobey their orders. But the grenadiers put their officers before their politicians. Murat shouted, "Citizens, you are dissolved!" More deputies slipped out of the hall, but a large group stood its ground. "Let us die for freedom," some of them shouted, but no one wanted to kill them. Lefebvre was hesitant to force them out, but had the last of his doubts tossed aside when he saw a soldier's sleeve being ripped by one of the angrier deputies. Murat could wait no longer. "Chuck this damned rabble out!" and the soldiers advanced with their bayonets. The terrified deputies leapt over the benches, ran into the passageways, and, according to legend, sprang out of the big ground-floor windows, throwing their red togas on the floor to flee incognito, and in 2 minutes the hall was cleared. As the deputies were fleeing across the garden, one officer suggested that they should order the soldiers to fire on them. Napoleon absolutely refused. "It is my wish that not a single drop of blood be spilled." Augereau, so far an uncommitted spectator, now decided to come down on the winning side, and congratulated Napoleon on organising a long overdue spring cleaning. Murat had an even better idea. Having put his life on the line over the past few days, he was keen to secure his ties to the Bonaparte family, and gallantly sent 4 troopers to the school where Napoleon's pretty youngest sister, Caroline, was studying, to escort her to safety, along with a letter telling her he wanted to be the first to let her know her brother had become leader of France, helped by himself. Meanwhile, the other Bonapartes had been waiting in suspense all day. They had been at an old Corsican friend's house, Madame Permont, who said she was surprised that Laetitia had not gone to see Josephine at such a critical time. Laetitia replied, "It is not to that quarter that I should look for comfort. It is to Julie, to Christine. It is with them that I see my sons happy, but with the other, no." To distract themselves, the Bonaparte women had all decided to go to the theatre, and when a scuffle broke out, thinking it was news from the coup, Laetitia began to tremble, but it was only the catching of a pickpocket. Suddenly, the actors on stage stopped, whispered, and then announced to the audience, "General Bonaparte has been nearly assassinated at Saint-Cloud by traitors to their country." At these words, the ever-dramatic Pauline screamed so loudly that all the audience turned to look at her. She continued to scream, with her mother trying to calm her, before Laetitia finally grabbed her by the arm. "Pauline, why are you making this exhibition of yourself? Be silent. Do you not understand that no harm has come to your brothers? Be silent then, and get up." Night was now falling over Paris. The conspirators went home, believing that tomorrow would be a better and brighter day, ushering in a splendid new era. 5 days later, Lefebvre told General Mortier, "This astonishing and salutary revolution has been made without any shock. It was urgently required. At 9 p.m, news of the coup was officially announced by a proclamation from the conspirators that was posted all over Paris, including the words, "There have been no victors or vanquished in the recent change of government, but only security for all." It was read by torchlight to the agitated groups which had gathered all over the city and was greeted with applause. With the exception of the most determined Jacobins, many French people were in favour of this new change of government, fearing fresh revolutionary terror and longing for political stability. As Napoleon wanted to give as much legality as he could to the coup, that same evening, when all had calmed down, he and Lucien gathered together the remaining members of the Council of the Ancients and the 500. Only those who supported the coup were present, and of the 500, Lucien could only find 50 deputies, so just 10% of them. They approved the measures suggested to them, declaring the Directory at an end because of the excesses and crimes to which they were constantly inclined, and gave power, with the title of provisional consuls, in Sièyes, Ducos, and Napoleon, in that order of importance, as the other two had both been directors, which offered a sense of continuity. 2 committees, taken from the old 2 councils, were selected to help the consuls create a new constitution, which everyone assumed Sièyes had already written. At 3 a.m, Napoleon threw himself into his carriage to return to Paris, but he did not say a word during the whole journey. He knew he had made a mistake in speaking of the god of victory and the god of war, but at a more fundamental level, the plan for a fully legal change of government had gone wrong. Napoleon had not wanted it said, once he was in power, that he had got there by using force against the representatives of the people. Yet this, with the furious deputies voting him an outlaw, was what had happened. Napoleon himself said of the coup, "Theorists have disputed, and will long dispute, whether we did not violate the laws, and whether we were not criminal, but these are mere abstractions, which should disappear before imperious necessity. One might as well blame a sailor for waste and destruction when he cuts away a mast to save his ship. The fact is, had it not been for us, the country would have been lost. We saved it." From that day on, as first consul, Napoleon would rarely make a political mistake. Napoleon arrived back at his house, where Josephine was anxiously waiting at the window, and she sprang outside to meet him. Napoleon embraced her, briefly recapped the day's events, and assured her that since he had taken the oath of office, he had not allowed himself to speak to a single person, because he wanted her to be the first to congratulate him. Before going to bed, he cheerfully exclaimed, "Good night, my Josephine. Tomorrow we sleep in the palace of the Luxembourg." The next day, Napoleon would start a new calling, in leading and reorganizing the Republic. It was less than 4 years ago since Napoleon had taken command of the army of Italy, and he was now at the summit of political power in France. Once, in an essay, as a second lieutenant, Napoleon had expressed the hope that on his deathbed he would be able to say, "I have ensured the happiness of 100 families. I have had a hard life, but the state will benefit from it." Now, at 30 years old, Napoleon was finally in a position to work for that goal. A new century was about to begin, and for France, a new epoch, one of the brightest periods in her history, the Consulate.